Okay, hi guys again. I guess we'll get started. I'm not sure if everybody's in or not. I'll get Carmen to come on the stage. And again, welcome to our weekly webinar series. We're offering these webinars during COVID-19 period on topic help build awareness on improvement methodology and tools that we used in past. So on today's topic, it's a cost reduction case study, which is from a Canadian mining operation. It will be presented by Carmen Sriello. He's founding member and a senior partner at Analyze Improve. He's been involved in continuous improvement for over 25 years and have global experience working directly in operations, technical, and corporate environments. He is a master black belt in Lean Six Sigma. And on today's topic, he has successfully delivered numerous continuous improvement projects designed to improve productivity, both to increase throughput and to reduce cost. Carmen is multilingual, including French, so those of you who are more comfortable in interacting in French with him, feel free. Before I hand over the stage to him, a little bit on the structure of our talk today. We'll start with the presentation on the topic. While the presentation is occurring, you can ask any questions that you may have in the questions tab on the right side of your screen. Carmen will keep an eye on the questions during presentation and will then answer them at the end. We'll also have an opportunity to talk face-to-face and discuss any further questions or interesting points through a Google Meet session after the webinar has ended. Link is present in the chat window for you to attend the socializing piece of our webinar if you want. Without further ado, let me hand this over to Carmen.
Great, thanks, Austin. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. It's great to have you all with us this morning. Basically, what we'll do is we'll be going through the steps that were taken to achieve major cost reduction at a client site. Now, the steps that you'll see, they're very clear steps, a clear path that was taken towards cost reduction. You'll see some logical steps that were followed. And the idea here is, as much as possible, attempted to sustain those cost reduction gains, basically. Now, some of the details are obviously not shown for privacy reasons for the client, but I can definitely try to answer any of your specific questions you may have at the end of this webinar. So on that, enjoy the next 15 to 20 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, obviously we're having technical difficulties with the video, so we'll go at plan B. There's always at least a plan B or C. What I'll do is I will simply present it live. I have the presentation here, and let's see if I can do this without making anything crash. Screen sharing, application, slideshow. All right, and I will just make sure that you guys can all see my screen. Awesome, just send me a little text if everything's fine. Hear a lot of beeps. Seems to be okay. All right, let's get the show on the road. So here's the cost reduction strategy that was used for a specific client. And starting at the 12 o'clock mark, we had departmental cost reduction initiatives. Number one, procurement and service strategy, organizational optimization, performance metrics, process stabilization, and bottleneck production strategy. And by putting them all together, the goal was to create sort of a path towards a major cost reduction. This was not just small improvements in cost. The objective was to achieve major savings in cost. What you see on the right-hand side with the arrow is sort of the path or some of the tools that were used, including define, measure, analyze, improve. Heavy dose of change management. As you'll see when you're dealing with cost reduction, change management is an amazing, incredible part of it in terms of building engagement. And sustaining the gains as much as possible. The effort, sure, there's going to be those one-time savings opportunities, but as much as possible, you want to set it up so that the gains are sustainable over the course of many months and years. Let's take a look at each one at a time. So departmental cost reduction. this is a great place to start. The idea of those 6 steps is there's a logic to it, and you want to start with the ones that are maybe easier, also a way of building engagement. There's many reasons why you want to flow in that specific order. So this is a great place to start. You building a lot of engagement and buy-in for the effort. Different levels of the organization, different areas, different departments. You can include operations. We include mobile maintenance, equipment maintenance, and especially support groups, right? It's not just about production or operations. Support groups, whether they be accounting, house, whatever the case may be, everyone gets involved and everyone got involved in coming up with ideas for cost reduction, looking at data, looking at opportunities, and targeting those savings. A very big one was the whole idea of procurement and service strategy. This is a great place to attack as well. We got a lot of strong benefits in here, and they were basically in these specific buckets. So the first one is the actual strategy of procurement. So what we did is we went in and negotiated or renegotiated the rates of the highest cost vendors. The reason I say or not, in some cases there was not a negotiation that was done. It was almost the price was offered by the supplier, and the client decided to pay it. So there was never this back and forth to try and get the optimum conditions. We also offered extensions and/or contracts in return for locked-in savings. There's a lot of things that can be done. You simply have to ask the question, where you can have, as much as possible, some sort of a win-win strategy between the client and the suppliers. We also challenged single source status. This is a very big area. A lot of controversy here because most operations and maintenance like to have that single source status for very good reasons, but we have to challenge that and make sure that the reason is sound. And a heavy dose of analysis as well, analyzing the historical cost of items and also the demand, of the items itself. And based on this, try and figure out what the cost reduction could and should be based on on that data. Another bucket is the actual support services. So what is the service level you desire? It's kind of counterintuitive, right? We always think we want the best and the highest quality and everything that goes with it. But everything works hand in hand. In some cases, we don't need the ultimate level of perfection. We don't need that high level of quality or service. So we have to define that. So one way of getting savings is by reducing service levels and expectations. So as an example for maintenance service providers, a great way that we started is to look at things that were non-critical processes or non-critical equipment and just ask for reducing service expectation. As an example, instead of having something that's serviced or analyzed weekly, maybe monthly or quarterly was good enough because of the level of expectations. It was also a case where we had the contractors on site just in case, meaning just in case something broke down or just in case there was a need or an opportunity. But in a lot of those cases, they were available locally. So within a few hours notice, you can have them on site anyway. So it didn't make sense to pay for that round the clock continuous coverage if you can sort of manage that on a need basis and with minimal risk. Contractors, this was something that was immediately implemented. The immediate monitoring of who was on site at any specific day, any specific week. Okay? And especially for a large company, it's sometimes very hard to know exactly who's there. So you may know company X is on site. Does company X have 3 representatives or employees, or they have 15, or do they have 20? So we put in a process for monitoring that number, and also immediately removing or asking certain numbers of people to leave if it was above a certain threshold. Another area we attacked is the best way to think of the category is moratoriums and directives from the highest level of the organization. In this case, it was the general manager. So here's an example, a list of things that were done immediately. Overtime were stopped, taxi usage, certain IT equipment ordering, hiring, rental agreements. The idea here is twofold. One is you're getting immediate savings, but it also sends a very strong message. This whole idea of change management, a big part of it is here where the senior people are demonstrating how important, how critical the cost reduction is. And you demonstrated this way with this list. One little note on this list at the bottom is they don't have to be permanent, right? These are things that can be done at time equals 0, and you may want to write it out for a few weeks just to send that message, and then you can loosen them up a little bit as people understand the importance of attacking these items. Third area is organizational optimization. Another very large area, little bit tricky to roll out properly. A lot of the examples you'll see here is often done improperly in industry, and hopefully you'll see some examples here of the proper way to roll it out. The first thing you have to do is actually review the design. So that's what we did. We went in and we reviewed the organizational design, the actual strategy for the organization. What are they trying to do? And basically the organizational design, the org chart has to support that vision, has to support that strategy. So a big part of that is to define the levels of work and the capabilities that are required. It's a lot of work that has to be done to understand that. But for the org chart to work, you have to understand what levels of work are expected at the different levels of the organization. And you know, at a very high level, what that involves is you need to have very distinct and clear levels of work that has to be defined. You need to elevate the organization. What I mean by elevate the organization is many times in any company, this company being no different, people tend to work lower than they're supposed to. So a manager perhaps should be looking at the next 3 months of the company's performance, or the next 6 months, but perhaps the manager is working day to day or week to week. They're getting a little too much into the weeds. So by doing this exercise, we're actually looking at where are the people working at versus where they should be working at. Eliminating forced or fake levels. This is usually a problem with companies that have a long history, that have been around for a little while, and this was no different. What that means is sometimes you create a role, or you create almost like a mini department that really doesn't have any fit in the org chart, or doesn't have any fit in the strategy of the organization, but was done in order to accommodate a specific person. And that's reviewed, and that's eliminated if it doesn't add any value to the company. And the last one is direct reports must fit within an acceptable band. What this means is, just like anything else in life, there is a theory that works within organizational optimization. And so a supervisor should have sort of a minimum, maximum number of people that report to him and her. So in a standard organization, sort of a rule of thumb, it can change a little bit, but as a rule of thumb, it should be no less than 3 people, but no more than 20. So if you see instances where you have less than 3 people reporting to you, or more than 20, that has to be challenged. What's the reason behind it? What's the purpose? Can things be merged? Is there a way of getting more efficient? And a lot of that was done with this specific client. Headcount rationalization, obviously this is part of it, whether we like it or not. We look at basically all the present roles that people had, the relationships, the reporting relationships between supervisor and worker. And more importantly is the skills that are required in the different groups and the different departments. In the rationalization, look, you're looking, and we did the same thing. We looked at different opportunities that existed in the existing org chart. Were there any inconsistencies, things that didn't make sense today? Perhaps there was a logic behind it, you know, a year ago or 5 years ago, but looking at it in a very sort of a clean, crisp analysis doesn't make any sense anymore. And also perhaps specific people. There may be specific people that are in the wrong role, and they should be working in different areas or different departments. So that is part of the rationalization process. Centralization doesn't always work. So it's there's a joke about, you know, companies always do this. They go from a centralized to decentralized, back and forth, depending on the flavor of the day. So we weren't trying to do that specifically. But I was looking at were there opportunities where centralization made sense, right? So there are opportunities to improve efficiency in some cases, because you have a centralized department, you can get better quality, you can get better efficiencies and transparencies and communication, everything that goes with a centralized group. And in some cases, definitely you can reduce headcount, which I'll talk a little bit about later. Not necessarily translates into full permanent layoffs, but sometimes can simply mean they're reassigned somewhere else where you can get better value for that person. And succession planning is something else we added to this work. If you're going to review org charts, if you're going to review centralization, all that stuff, we wanted to make sure that there was at least some form of succession planning process, that it had to be developed and it had to be aligned. So what were those, just like anything else, what are the key roles, what are the key risks in the org chart, and make sure that where it was critical, that we had a succession plan put in place. The fourth bucket is called the performance metrics. Basically here, the activity at this point, now you're getting into a full-blown mapping exercise. So you're mapping the different cost structures, whether they be, again, operational, maintenance, services, labor, energy, whatever the case may be. And you're trying to map it in order to understand the leverage points. And what I mean by leverage points is which of those factors, by making a small change, give you the biggest bang for the buck. So low effort, giving you the largest cost savings. And by doing this mapping exercise, and in some cases, Monte Carlo analysis, minimum, maximum, most likely type of analysis, then you're able to come up with a new list of items that become strong levers for cost reduction that perhaps haven't been looked at. We're getting to the fifth one, so now there's a little bit more homework that has to be done. This one's called process stabilization, a lot more analysis. So in this case, what you're trying to do, the concept behind stabilization, is you're trying to eliminate both the extreme lows and extreme highs. So with the extreme lows, meaning something bad happened, something broke down, or we had lack of communication or mix-up, or we didn't follow the standard, there's many reasons for it. So the reason that you want to look at this is you want to understand what caused this extreme low and maybe do a root cause analysis, find out what happened, solve it, mistake-proof it, and hopefully it doesn't come back again. But you also want to identify the extreme highs. We don't want any of this up and down, up and down. So we want something that's a lot smoother, a lot flatter. And a lot of times, in this case, was also seen, you actually want to pull back a little bit from these peaks. You want to stabilize it. And by stabilizing it, you actually have something that costs less to run. It's a lot more predictable and easier to operate, basically. In the second bullet there, it's a little bit of the same. Sometimes another benefit that we were able to put in place by eliminating those peaks is you're able to use that stability in order to catch up. So in some cases, you can stop a piece of equipment or a parallel line and just allow maintenance to catch up, do some of its preventative maintenance, and actually just make sure the equipment runs better over the long term. We identified and analyzed many of the unplanned downtime events. So anything that was process that was down and was not planned, we wanted to try and understand it, group it, create some form of a Pareto chart, and try to solve that problem for the future. Define, investigate, verify, and ensure that anything that is a repeat event is attacked. And in general, when we're talking about mistake proofing, you're trying to reduce the probability of the event happening, or ideally eliminate it. You don't want it to ever happen again, right? And the way you do this actually is we try to prioritize. It's very hard to do this across the board. This is an issue that happens many times with companies. You take a tool and you apply it across, and it becomes very, very heavy. So here what we did is we identified the critical processes and just focused on those critical elements and made sure that we understood the root cause and applied some mistake-proofing techniques. Essentially, as you see there on the slide, you treat it like an incident. So an incident is not just something that's health and safety related. You can have incidents that are production, operation, maintenance related as well. And the goal here was to generate at least one mistake-proofing activity or solution for every downtime event on a critical equipment. That was the goal of that exercise. And last, number 6, is bottleneck production strategy. So at this point, what you're trying to do is come up with an overall plan, an overall scenario and picture of the operation. So identified the overall production bottlenecks. More importantly, what we tried to do is we identified the losses which cannot be caught up, which is the definition of the bottleneck. So if you truly have something that's critical, that's a bottleneck, that hour that you lost is an hour that's lost forever. There is no catching up of that hour. So we selected those main constraints, that primary bottleneck, the secondary constraints, and essentially we wanted to understand what they were and that had major impacts on revenue when they were down. Okay. So the idea here, once you know what those constraints are, so then you ensure that these processes are properly supported, meaning as soon as we were able to identify the few, 1, 2, 3 processes that were critical, those ones have to be supported 100%. There should be no reason whatsoever that they didn't have the right people, the right parts, the right inventory, whatever the case may be. There's no reason that they should be starved of any of that attention. Of course, the flip side is all the other processes that are not as critical, that are not bottlenecks, that are not critical, they can be treated differently. They can be, for example, slowed down in a few cases. We were able to do that. You can also try and eliminate wastes that were associated with them. I already gave another example where you can stop them a little bit more often, and we're able to do a lot more maintenance on those issues, on those pieces of equipment, because they weren't as critical. And so we looked at anything that had to do with overproduction, overprocessing, or just general wastes that were associated with some of these things, and just remove them. The way, for some of you have probably seen this tool before, but a really, really great way to both monitor the efforts that were done with cost reduction and also present it to upper management is this tool called the waterfall chart. And we used exactly the same tool. And basically it's been normalized so that the numbers are on a basis of 100 million, but it's exactly the same tool and magnitude that was used for this specific client. So I'll walk through it very quickly just to give you an example. So here on the left, you start with what the budget was for the year. So in this example, 100 million. And one thing that we did right away, which is a mistake that's often done with other projects, is you have to actually understand what the reality is today. So although the budget may have been 100, I wanted to understand, were there unplanned events that have already happened in the year? Are there other corrections because of volume or currency exchange? And are there other examples that we already know that we're going to overspend based on that budget? So by doing that exercise right up front, that 100 million came up to actually, let's say, 109 million because of these negative corrections. So we're not working off the 100 anymore. We're working off the 109. That's the true present state of spending for this specific example in this specific company. And then the way I chose to present it here is using these specific approaches or these specific tools with respect to cost reduction. So in the first case, there's everything to do with waste reduction. The best way to think of this is sort of like low-hanging fruit. Great way of engaging people. You don't need heavy, intense data analysis. A lot of it is based on observations and getting people to just speak up on things they already know and see on a day-to-day basis. So that's waste reduction. Then technical projects, often called sort of Six Sigma projects. There's a lot more analysis and analytics involved. They also take a little longer to solve. It could be anywhere from a few months to 6 months. So that gets captured here. And then as you're locking in these savings, these are actual savings that are locked in and completed, then it's very important also to capture the ones that are on standby, sort of waiting to be executed. In this example with this client, we decided to divide them up between high and low potential. High potential simply meant the project was well defined. There was a good probability of success based on past history or just based on sort of the experiences of the people involved. And then on the low potential side, they were usually either not well defined yet, so you could go from low to high potential with a bit more homework, or they were projects that were a little bit more stretched. We weren't sure if they were going to work, but we still wanted to capture them. And then you add up all these green bars to come up with what the costs will now become as we put them all in place. So this 109 would drop down to 95. And then the last part of a waterfall is very important. What did the client want in terms of expectations for the new cost structure, right? So in this example, we still wanted to get to 90. We fell short, so we weren't able to get to 90 with this game plan right here. And so we say, okay, we still have an additional gap of 5 million. What else do we have on our list? What else do we have in our analysis that we can try to identify these 5 extra million and drop them into the left-hand side of this these 4 bars? Okay. So great way again to not only monitor but also to present and demonstrate the savings and where you're at with respect to cost reduction. So in summary, the idea of a good cost reduction pathway and plan is there's a heavy amount of data analysis. You need to really understand the data, the historical data, who's doing what, who's involved, contractors, consultants, consumables, whatever the case may be. You need to know where you're at today in order to understand where you can get tomorrow. Change management and engaging the workforce. I mean, that is always important in any improvement project. But I would say when you're dealing with cost reduction, it's very critical. People need to feel comfortable. They need to feel engaged of why they're doing this. There has to be a reason we're doing this. Are we doing it to be better positioned for the future? Are we in this client's case, they were doing it because the profit margins were very slim. And so the cost reduction would allow you to go from a loss scenario to a gain scenario. So that had to be communicated to the workforce. And as I mentioned before, it was one of the things that the client was very interested in is it had to be structured and sustainable, right? So this is not something we wanted to do as a one-time savings effort. Yes, there are some one-timers, so there's no doubt about it. There's some things that you save once and you should not discount it. You should capture it that way. But as much as possible, see if you can lock them in terms of a repeat savings, something that can be sustained over a longer period of time, for instance, renegotiating a contract over many years. And as a final note on this slide, there are definitely other approaches. I don't mean to insinuate those are the only techniques available, but what's important is the idea of having something that's logical with the sort of the quick wins at the beginning and making sure that the approach is both customized to the situation and to the client needs. That is probably the main takeaway in this webinar. So on that, I will thank you for your participation. I will now toggle back to the webinar screen. Okay, and I will take a look if there are any questions or yeah, and actually what I'll do to give everyone a chance to catch up a little bit is if I go back to my presentation, there is a question that came up offline that I just threw a slide together, and it had to do with the reality that during this COVID pandemic, that there's a very interesting scenario coming up where companies are being forced to run with less people, and they're still getting a decent amount of production out of it, right? And for myself, there's a very strong analogy to when a company goes on strike duty, right? When a company does still operates in strike, they often see the same thing where you see the ability to produce at a certain level with less people. So here's an example. This is actual numbers from a few of our past and present clients. In some cases, they're using anywhere from 25 to 80% of resources and generating 75 to 100% of production levels, which is just incredible, right? And the question, though, is it's kind of an open question, and we can just leave it as an open concept, is how and why is this happening, right? There's many typical reasons why you can get the same level of production with less people. So, for instance, you can have reduced maintenance because you're hoping that this is not going to last very long. You kind of cut back on your preventative maintenance. Focus only on priorities, whether they be departmental or whatever you're making. You're only going to focus on what's truly critical. You definitely can get better consistencies in communication because there's less people. So if you imagine a process that may have a dozen human beings in a regular process, when you're on light duty, you may only have 2 or 3 people working on it, and all of a sudden that level of standardization and communication becomes super smooth. Right? A higher focus and attention. There's other reasons as well, but these are some typical ones. And so the challenge here for us as a community and for companies is to try and understand what exactly is the reason you're gaining some of these added efficiencies, because some of them are short-term savings. And what I mean by short-term is you can't actually sustain them over a long term. So as an example, if you're not doing proper maintenance because you're thinking this is only going to last, a month or two, that's fine. You could bank that savings today, but know that in 2, 3, 4 months that will come back, and then you will require to put that time and effort and money back where you were skipping it before. And some cases, it's definitely sustainable savings. For instance, you may learn that the number of workers you needed for a certain activity is not as much as you originally had. So that is a learning that you could have and you could lock in for the future. So just a little bit of a food for thought for those of you attending today's webinar. Okay, I see a question. Is management change type process used to ensure the savings are sustainable or do not introduce additional risk? Yeah, good question. Management of change, there was some of that was used, but I have to admit we took more of an approach of change management. And I will, some of you will say, well, what's the difference? But I'll quickly go to a slide here just for your information. So it doesn't really matter what the approach is. What is important is some thought is put together to understand what the risks are. So whether it is some kind of management of change approach, but the approach we took here is one that followed this model, which I won't go into today. But the idea here is you want to look and you want to understand first as a team. We wanted to understand this change that we're about to do. What is the positive of the change and the negative of not changing? And then the reverse, the negative of the change and the positive of not changing. And this had to be first internalized. So we debated this as a team in-house, and then involve other people, right? Involve some of the workers to say, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I understand the purpose of the change and I'm on board. I want to do this. And that's one of the reasons, if you remember, if we go back to, this pathway, one of the reasons we started here is because it goes hand in hand with that selling of the message and getting buy-in. Is if you can explain it, some people call it that burning platform, if everyone understands why we're trying to reduce costs, and then you get them involved on a departmental level. Everyone gets involved, even if it's something small. If you're in charge of office supplies, okay, your job is to save on ordering pens and paper. Well, 5% saving is 5% savings. There's no dollar amount that's too small or too big to make it on the list, basically. Good question. Excellent question. I'm just going to take a look. Okay. Not sure if there's any other. Oh, there is a question in the question page. Based on your experience, do you have a Pareto scale savings of the 6 areas, highest and lowest? Yeah, very good question. I'll leave the slide on. That's where it is. As you can imagine, it varies quite a bit, right? But I can give a little bit of my gut feelings in terms of some of the experiences we had with the cost saving initiatives. Procurement and service strategy is big. Okay, the number 2 bucket, this one here, it's actually huge for many reasons that I already mentioned, right? A lot of the attention that gets put into procurement and service strategies usually gets done at the very, very beginning. So imagine you're a new company or you're starting up a brand new mine. So special attention is taken to say, oh, we have to understand who's going to deliver it and what are the terms. But then it starts falling apart, right? There's not as much attention usually. I'm generalizing. There's not as much attention that's put into this, and because of that, it tends to get a lot of waste and a lot of fat gets built into these contracts, right? So if I go back to, I'll show you a slide here. So because of that, this area becomes a very large bucket for us when we do these cost reduction savings. The idea of challenging the single source vendors makes a big difference, because as soon as you can get away from it, and I know there's a lot of people attending that have a lot of experience that's negative, right? If you don't do this properly and you switch to, well, anybody can supply this pump for us or this part, then it goes very bad, right? You're going to have difficulty with the parts, the reliability of the part. So we're not talking about that. What we're talking about is if truly that element of that part, we don't need it from the original source, then you could have tremendous savings. I won't quote some of the specificness, but especially for parts, if you get away from the original provider and you can at least understand what's available out there, there's tremendous savings there. Raw materials, this is a good exercise as well. Both Asim and I have done many examples in here. You try and understand what's going on in industry today. So for instance, if there's a major price drop in oil or rubber or steel or whatever the case may be, you need to know that, because if certain commodity or certain element has dropped, then you make a sort of a link. You make a link with what kind of products you're buying. You say, well, if rubber dropped or steel dropped or fuel dropped, therefore the product you're delivering to me and the product you're providing to me should also have a major cost savings. So you have to do your homework up front. And this number two is usually, I would say, one of the things that is at the very top of the Pareto chart. The other one that would be very big is, but it takes a little while to get there, is when you get to the back end, when you get to things that identify the bottlenecks and you could truly understand what those constraints are, they start generating a lot of the savings as well when you get to the back end. Okay, let's see, there's more chat. Another comment. Please provide some examples on challenging the vendor, what was agreed upon versus what was actually supplied. Okay, yeah, let me go back to challenging the vendor. I'll go back to the slide so I can pick on things that are specific. It varied tremendously, right? So in terms of what was negotiated, so let's look at this one first. So in terms of this extension, you know, a lot of times the contracts did not exist, or they were a 1-year contract. And so that was a relatively simple exercise. We would say, okay, we'll offer you a 3-year contract, but you give us a 10 or 15% savings over that 3-year mark. A little bit of negotiation, of course, between the term and the rate, but that was fairly straightforward. I think in most of the cases that we did that one, the vendors were totally on board, especially if they were small to mid-size. They wanted the stability, right? Everybody's searching for stability. So the fact that you're able to sign a 3-year or 5-year contract with a mine means that you have some assurance that you'll get some cash over the next 3 to 5 years, even if it's a slightly reduced rate. Linked to that is I believe they're still doing it, but it's what I often call the Walmart model, or I think GM does the same thing. In a lot of these cases with the big companies, they'll have a major supplier, a supplier that provides you with 80% of the units, but then you'll also have a minor supplier that supplies you with 20%. So that technique is really good, because with the 80, you've got your steady state, you have your ability to feed the parts that you need. But lurking in the shadows is the B supplier, who is working really hard. They want to go from the 20 to the 81 and eventually become your major supplier. So you can actually use that as a way to see, am I getting the best bang for the buck from my main supplier, and perhaps my secondary supplier is showing me ways of getting better returns, right? Another example that I can show is this one here. This was great as well. Great because it's a question we rarely ask, and I kind of alluded that in the video. We always think, well, well, I'll give you a specific example. If it's a camp, so the camp has cleaning, kitchen services, janitorial, whatever the case may be. So we challenged it, right? It's nothing's taboo, nothing's off the limits or out of scope. We challenged everything and say, what exactly are the expectations that we have in terms of cleaning that corridor or cleaning our rooms or cleaning the gymnasium or whatever the case may be, right? So if we don't ask that question, of course, the vendors say, oh, we clean that hallway 17 times a day. As well, we don't need to clean 17 times a day. Actually, once every 3 days is probably good enough, right? So there were many of those examples that generated tremendous savings. The savings there is not about rate necessarily. It's more about the manpower that was required to generate the service levels that they thought you wanted. So as soon as you reduce that service level in terms of, in this example, the camp, then you don't need 20 camp contractors. Maybe it dropped down to 15 or 14 or 12. I can't remember the numbers by heart. The maintenance one is also one in terms of maintenance expectations, both internal and external supplied maintenance. And yeah, that was also an example where if it was not a critical process or a process that was, for all intents and purposes, extremely stable and reliable and not critical, then yeah, we went in and reduced the maintenance expectation for that specific part. Here, some specifics. Well, that list is already specific. Now, in terms of dollars, I think the biggest one obviously was overtime. Biggest both in terms of dollar value and message, right? So the message being sent is you need to be more organized, and we're not gonna just tack on overtime because we're not organized, because we didn't plan properly or because we didn't do our homework properly. And yeah, so those are some examples of specifics. Hopefully I answered your question, but if not, we'll have another chance afterwards to deal with some specifics. There's a comment here from Ken. Just to add to what Carmen has said, my experience is that if you can define upfront what is being agreed upon, think about expected quantity, quality, resources, and time, then it is easier to go back and question the vendor if expectations are not met. Yeah, 100% agree with Ken. If it's done properly and you define those up front, then you have that already in your contract, right? You say, well, I defined what I expected in terms of quantity, quality, and to add to this concept that Ken mentioned is you define those four things, but you also have to tell me, or I'm the client, I have to tell you which ones of those are the most important. What is the most important for me in terms of those? If I can define that, then you as a provider can say, okay, I understood. You defined what your expectations are. And the most important is this specific bullet or this specific element. But it's never too late, right? Even if you don't have that in the contract today, in the example of the contracts, then when you review this as a contract vendor or whatever, even if it's a part-time role, then you're able to do that at that point. You say, okay, we didn't define it up front, our bad, but let's try to define now. Let's try to define what the expectations of this department and of our company is when it comes to any of these service providers, whether they be material or whatever the case may be. Great questions. I'm seeing if there's anything else that maybe I missed. One last part. I didn't answer part of the question about the Pareto scale, highest and lowest. I would say on the lowest side, if you're looking at strictly dollars, that first, let me go back. This one here, departmental cost reduction, sometimes it ends up being the smallest bar, but I already explained a few times why we do it, right? It's about engagement. It's about getting everyone on board. It's about teaching people the elements of waste. And as soon as you have people understanding waste, then great things happen, because it's not just about cost reduction in terms of this, but it's about improving efficiency, getting more for what you have, because in the end, it's a sort of a in versus out. So I can reduce costs, but I may find great opportunities where for the same cost, I can get 20% more throughput or 20% more product, right? So that's the reason for this number one. But strictly speaking, from a Pareto scale, it usually tends to be on the low end of total costs received, especially if a company's been doing, cost reduction initiatives over a long period of time. Okay, I think we've covered most, if not all, the comments and questions. I'll wait for Awesome to get back. I will stop sharing my screen, I suppose.
Yeah.
And back to
Okay.
you.
Thanks, Carmen. Yeah, and if there are any more questions, obviously, as I was saying earlier, that there is a piece which we built in part of this webinar series is engagement at the end of the webinar. So if you guys want to join, I'm sharing that link again in the comments. There. Guys, hopefully we'll see you for the next webinar.
Yeah, you cut out a little bit, but
Next week.
just in case you missed that, there is a link that was just sent again. If you click on that link, you'll be able to join us face to face and have an informal chat on any of the topics we covered, or perhaps a topic that you just want to chat about offline. So with that, I want to thank each and every one of you for attending. And again, don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions by email. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.